Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tanya Butchell, and before we get into the great presentation today, I'd like to familiarize you with our platform. As you can see, there's a few things we need to cover before we start. If you would like to know more about today's speakers, you can navigate to the top right-hand corner of your screen under Speakers, where you'll learn all about our subject experts. Also, on the right side of the panel, you are going to find Chat. Under Chat, there will be important messages from today's presenters. We will also be conducting some polls. This will be important for you to participate in, and you will find those under our Polls tab. During today's session, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A and submit your questions there. We will be answering questions throughout today's call. At the very end, if we do not get to those questions, we will be responding to them in a timely manner. For your reference, today's presentation will be recorded and shared with you. If you're interested in learning more about any other thing, please refer to the resources shared with you. Okay, welcome to today's group. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Grateful to be with all of you today, and grateful that you're taking the time to join us. This is the second IAG Workgroup 11 webinar. Last month, if you were not able to attend, we focused on the why of ESG and the importance of stakeholder engagement. Today, we're focused on what are the obligations driving us to act. In case you are interested in going back to the prior webinar, I am putting that in the chat now. So feel free to bookmark that to watch later in case you missed it. Right now, I'd like to, before we jump in, I'm going to bring up the agenda on this slide as we have such great presenters with you today that I'm a fan of each of theirs. Before we jump into that, let's do a poll. So our poll today is going to be, coming into this webinar, how comfortable are you with understanding global obligations around human rights and emissions and climate-related reporting? So let me go ahead and launch that poll for you. Should be up there now. Give everyone a minute to find that. We look forward to tallying those responses. All right, so far it seems like the majority have a general understanding, but they're not quite sure they feel prepared. Good to know, because that's why we're hosting this webinar for you today. All right, so let's continue on. What we do in IAG is so critical, the level of collaboration we have. And so before we dive into our panel, let me ask Jim Wilson, partner at Webster, Chamberlain and Bean, LLP, and IAG's general counsel, to review the compliance reminders that we start every meeting off with, which is what allows us to have such great collaboration at our industry level.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I'll review these compliance reminders, which are critical for all IAEG programming, whether it be in-person meetings like we had in Toulouse last month, webinars like this, or even in informal social settings associated with in-person events. We conduct all IAEG work and programming in compliance with our governance requirements, including our antitrust compliance policy and conflict of interest policy. IAEG, like other associations, is a unique forum where competitors come together, and so we have to be absolutely mindful of and compliant with antitrust laws and competition laws around the world, which limit the sorts of collaborations and discussions that competitors can have. We're very careful about that. In furtherance of that, we distribute an agenda before each meeting, and we abide by that agenda. We distribute minutes after each meeting that accurately describe what was discussed. We don't have any conversations within IAEG, and certainly no agreements regarding prices, pricing policy, wages, or any other restraints on competition of any kind. Whether to use any IAEG work product or deliverable is a voluntary choice of each individual company that has to be decided upon unilaterally and not discussed with competitors. We hope that what we provide is useful to you, but the ultimate decision on whether to use it, to what extent to use it, is your company's unilateral decision. And again, IAEG is very careful about not collecting or disseminating information on pricing methods, margins, wages. We do not disclose non-public supplier-customer relationships or any other competitively sensitive information. Next slide, please. We also, I will summarize some of these. We don't get into export control information or any other member proprietary information. We only collect personal data and information as necessary to have people register for our events and meetings. And again, as I mentioned before, these sorts of guidelines apply to any meeting or programming at IAEG, whether formal or informal. Just a word about the presentation specifically today. You will hear individual presentations from companies about their own journeys in certain matters, their own perspectives on certain things. Those are provided for informational purposes only. It's not a mandate. Any company can make any decision that it unilaterally decides to on these matters. These are provided for really for educational reasons. So with that, Ashley, I think I'm turning it back to you for the substantive part of the programming today.
Thank you very much, Jim. All right, now that you understand the importance that the compliance program plays across IAEG, that it enables us to come together like this, I want to just share a little bit more about IAEG. IAEG has been in place for 10 years. As you can see here on the chart, it's comprised of 46 members. Those members are listed below at the bottom. But really what that equates to, and this is how I look at it, is the signal. What those 46 members represent is 70% of our industry. And that was identified as a $488 billion component. And so what you can see here is that this signal of us coming together to achieve what you see right there in the center, because that's our center focus, is providing leading edge solutions across the value chain. And most recently, what has occurred is IAEG for the first 10 years was focused on environmental. But starting last year, we expanded to all elements of ESG. So now that you see foster sustainability and enable the supply chain, which is exactly why we are here today. Now, let me get to the panel that we have today. Let me introduce our panel. Nadine O'Boyle. Nadine has a background in engineering and has been with Collins Aerospace for 15 years, spanning roles in program management, contracts, business process management, and supply chain. Her passion for the planet and its people has led her to her current role leading the supply chain ESG strategy for Collins. Nadine is pursuing a Master's of Sustainability Leadership from Arizona State University. She lives in Cleveland, Ohio, with her husband and 2 children, Kane and Nina, who are truly her motivation for driving sustainability transformation in the industry and beyond. Nadine is an active member of IAEG and is co-leading the Workgroup 11 rollout workstream. Fun fact, Nadine and her son developed a school supply recycling program for his preschool. They placed bins in each classroom to collect discarded markers, pens, and crayons. I'm sure there's tons of crayons. The students help and learn by sorting the type and color and collect and ship them to recycling programs. And they're working to expand the program to offer more sustainable supply options for the school and families. Next up, Catherine Rushforth. With more than 20 years experience working in the aviation and aerospace industry, Catherine is currently leading Airbus's ambition to embed and advance respect for human rights throughout Airbus's global business, operations, and supply chain. This role reflects Airbus's commitment towards progressing the top of human rights in line with the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights and OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, as well as Airbus's commitment to the principles of the UN Global Compact. Catherine has a Master's of Science in Responsible Business Practice, is a fellow of the Institute of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability, and has recently completed a master's course in business and human rights through Bergen University. Now, you'll have to get with Catherine afterwards to learn the exact title, but I will say the fun fact about Catherine is she has received a very uniquely named honor for her dog training talents. Up next, we have Dave Graber. Dave Graber has been with Boeing for 20 years in engineering, compliance, and supply chain roles. He currently leads Boeing's supply chain sustainability program in partnership with the company's sustainability and compliance organizations. Dave is on the IAG Board of Directors, a co-sponsor for Workgroup 11, and engaged in the association's strategic planning committee. Now, where you'll find Dave, he enjoys fly fishing and exploring new places by gravel bike in the summer, and then in the winter, finding those peaceful places to ski. And I am just in awe of these individuals. And my name is Ashley Rubinski. I'm the Senior Project Manager in Lockheed Martin for Supply Chain Engagement and Sustainability. In this capacity, I'm responsible for shaping the corporation's supply chain enterprise communication and change management strategies and advancing the way we signal our values through sustainability. I've been with Lockheed Martin 28 years. Outside of work, you'll find that I'm a hospice volunteer because I believe everybody's story is value and beautiful, and that from the first chapter to the last chapter, any chance you get to make somebody's story enrich their story is an honor. And that's exactly what we're doing here in IAG. We're starting a new story. We're in our early chapters. And again, we are just grateful that you're showing up to join this new community. So let's turn things over now to the first question. Nadine, starting with you, but the question being, what are the global requirements stemming from ESG obligations that are driving our industry to act?
Great, thank you, Ashley. Thank you for the question and for including me here today to help spread some awareness. I do have 2 slides to help answer this question. But first, really quickly, just touching back on the last webinar, as we discussed, the last few years have really brought an increased heightened focus to the ESG discussion. As we have a more connected world and global supply chain, with that comes a web of embedded risks and environmental and social impacts. There's also been a resounding call to action from stakeholders, whether that's our investors, our customers, communities, our own employees. And so as such, organizations have been setting goals, publishing ESG related data, but there's really been kind of a lack of standards or regulatory frameworks that help drive accountability to the claims those organizations are making. And that's really, I think, where we're starting to see the change here. So some jurisdictions you'll see have been subject to reporting and disclosure requirements for a while now. But really what we're starting to see is that supply chain duty of care legislation beginning to emerge. And also coming with this is an increased emphasis on the S in the ESG, and particularly human rights. And so we'll take a look at the requirements here in a moment, but I'll just mention that they're going to vary by country, the size of your organization. Some of them have some specifics based on your sector or product, but really, again, that trend is expanding from reporting obligations to a more holistic due diligence of the full value chain. So what this would actually look like in practice is companies identifying their risk throughout the supply chain through some sort of mapping process, assessing, actioning, and accounting for those activities across their business partners. So it's really a program approach. And one other thing we'll touch on too are trade bans. And so we're starting to see that now, where if we are unable to demonstrate human rights duty of care for the products that are crossing borders, they won't be permitted to enter the market. So that's a critical risk we need to keep an eye on. So given the criticality of these emerging legislations, it's really important to understand for your business which are effective for you, when they're going to come into effect, and what actions you need to put in place. So on the next slide here, I have a little bit more detail. And I am by no means a compliance officer or legal expert. I'm just trying to share some additional scope to give you some perspective on what we're facing. So in the first column here, we're taking a look at the corporate reporting laws. And so on the top here, ones that have been enacted, you can see some of them probably look familiar. They've been in place for several years now. And then at the bottom, we have ones that are proposed. So as I mentioned, in terms of corporate reporting, some of these have been in place now for a few years. And really the requirement is around disclosing actions that we're taking relative to human rights, trafficking, and modern slavery, such as the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act, as well as the UK Modern Slavery Act. Now, the new one that has been proposed is the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And that's expanding on some of the current frameworks that are already in place in the EU, but taking a look at it from a different taxonomy. So organizations of 250 people or more that meet a certain minimum revenue or assets total are going to be required to report and be accountable for their consolidated ESG performance for each of their companies in the EU and their worldwide subsidiaries. In the next column then for due diligence, here's where we get into a little more of the program aspect. It's the one we've been talking about the most here for the near-term radar is the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. That has been enacted and will go into effect starting in 2023 for reporting in 2024 for organizations with 3,000 or more employees. And there's a little bit more that goes into the effectivity for each of these. You'll have to review in each of the respective documents. But this one's coming up pretty quick. And what it's going to require is that there's a risk management system in place, that organizations are conducting an annual risk analysis of your business areas and sub-tiers, that you have preventative measures for identifying risks, you have ways to enact remedial actions, minimize violations of an obligation that is imminent or occurred, have complaint procedures in place, and then you're documenting and reporting your due diligence obligation. So a lot involved there. The next one probably worth pointing out under the proposed legislation is the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And the first group will go into effect 2 years after approval. And some of these things tend to take a long time to get through comment cycles and revisions. So more to come on timing for this one. But generally speaking, what this would look like is that for organizations with 500 employees and $150 million euro annual turnover, I'll have some similar due diligence requirements to what we reviewed for the German Supply Chain Act. It also has some climate change requirements as well that align with the Paris Agreement. One thing I think that's also worth mentioning for this column here is that some of these regulations often carry repercussions for noncompliance, and those can come in the terms of fines and some even with criminal sanctions. And then the last column here is trade regulation. Now, there are aspects of this that really fit into due diligence, but I think the impact here was worth spiking out. So the first one here for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act has been enacted here in the United States, and that's going to prevent any products coming in from that territory in China where we are unable to demonstrate human rights due diligence will not be allowed to cross borders. And then we have a similar ban that's been proposed for the EU for any goods made with forced labor. So a lot more to come there. Again, this is something I think we're really going to have to keep an eye on in terms of impact to our product and making sure it continues to flow. But really at the end of the day, what I'd like to communicate is that we need to understand where these laws impact our business. And the sooner that we can enact programs for compliance, the easier it will be for us to maintain business, limit disruptions, and improve our business decisions. So thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Nadine. David, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, a couple points to add on to this to build on top of Nadine's summary. If you look at this chart here and you go left to right, you see the velocity of change in the global regulatory space. Roughly 10 years ago, let's say, it started with these disclosure type corporate reporting laws that were have your modern slavery statement on a website. But there wasn't necessarily the back-end regulator due diligence about proof that you're doing all of these actions. The due diligence laws in the middle, I think, took that next step, that it's not about necessarily just saying what you do, but having all the transparent proof points of what you do and the metrics behind it and the communication regarding your methods and how you are remediating risks that are found. And then lastly, to Nadine's point, the most recent evolution in this trade regulatory space, to foot stomp that, if a customs agency in the US or the EU suspects there's forced labor in a good that is being imported and placed on the market, it is incumbent upon the business, those of us on the phone, to show our due diligence and rebut the presumption of forced labor. That is a really interesting evolution here because it can slow down the velocity of supply chains. I will say aerospace not the target, but what's interesting is expectations are that forced labor is managed all the way through to the lowest level of the supply chain. So you think of polysilicates that are coming out of regions of China that might end up in solar panels per se, that end up in an aerospace and defense product. That's where this gets really interesting. Another piece I'll note here is I highly recommend people familiarize themselves with the forced labor statistics provided by the ILO, the International Labor Organization. I'd have to fact check myself on this, but I believe the most recent statistics are there are 47 million people globally trapped in forced labor situations. That is a lot of what is driving these types of laws and regulation. But also that should be the call to action for us as responsible businesses to do the right thing in addition. And it's nice to see the evolution of the complexity of the laws and the expectations to help make that step forward as being global citizens. And frankly, the other major component that I see from a supply chain view in what is responsible aerospace and sustainable aerospace beyond the emissions component is how we address these social matters in our supply chains. Finally, Ashley, I'll add in, if people are looking at this list and thinking of, is this a good baseline to start from to understand obligations, expectations, just in the general themes, I would say yes, this is a nice collective set. And there's two others you could add on here, which is New Zealand's Modern Slavery Act that's currently in work, and Japan recently released human rights guidelines for businesses. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Dave. It's clear that today it would be impossible to cover all obligations that are driving us to act. But as you can see here, we started with the ones that we thought are prevalent. We wanted to get these out to you so that you can take the time to learn more about them. And let's continue our discussion so we can share some more insights. I believe Catherine is having trouble technically, so we're going to move forward to the question around. Let's see, maybe she's able to join us.
Hi, I don't, you can hear me?
Hi, Catherine.
Okay, super. So hopefully everything's working okay.
Terrific. So we were just about to ask you, what approach is your organization taking in order to comply with the growing legislation?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ashley. And yeah, I'm really, really thrilled to be here today to raise awareness of this really growing topic. So just before I get onto that, you know, obviously there's this seemingly avalanche of legislation that's coming at us, and also, as has been said previously, also growing stakeholder expectations as well. And this legislation's growing both in terms of number and strength. And the German Act, for example, was a real game changer in that respect. But what is common is this requirement for human rights due diligence and transparency through mandatory reporting. And I think, you know, also it's very clear that this focuses on identifying and mitigating risk to people rather than risk to the business, which brings another dimension. Also, just to mention as well that, you know, all these different kinds of legislation, particularly the ones that are linked to trade and sanctions, really have the potential to expose businesses to supply chain disruption in the case of non-compliance. So it's really something to sort of keep on top of. And also, if you think that, you know, a piece of legislation is just focused on one country and you're not in that country, then I would absolutely warn you, because, you know, a lot of this legislation, although it differs from country to country, in practice does impact a broad range of businesses directly or indirectly, including those in supply chains, you know, of those sort of directly subject to those legal requirements. So be warned, if you know, if you're not impacted directly, you could be impacted indirectly as well. But just getting onto this, so I guess it's quite daunting seeing all this legislation, but what sort of binds all this legislation really are two key international frameworks. So, and these frameworks really seek to promote a common understanding against governments and stakeholders on due diligence. So these soft laws are now becoming hard laws and therefore legally binding. And while some sort of, you know, include these soft laws implicitly, they're also increasingly becoming more explicit, such as the German law and also the draft EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they are really the authoritative global framework for human rights, and we call it the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework. And what that really states is that businesses have a duty to protect human rights. States have a duty to protect human rights through the introduction of statutory instruments, so laws. And then businesses have a duty to comply with those laws, but also to respect human rights. And businesses are required to do that by having a policy commitment to respect human rights, by conducting ongoing due diligence, and by having a grievance mechanism where violations of human rights or any concerns can be raised. And then it's both the duty of the state and the duty of the business to provide remedy, to put things right where violations are found. And the UNGPs are really articulated through key standards. So the OECD, which was actually the first international instrument to integrate respect for human rights as a corporate responsibility, therefore being fully aligned with the United Nations Guiding Principles, and also the ILO core conventions, which mainly cover worker rights, which were updated to incorporate the UNGPs. And as mentioned previously, they all focus on this increased transparency through mandatory reporting. And these key principles bring expectations to identify and address human rights and environmental issues, and as I mentioned, provide remedy. So if we just move to the other slide, we can take a closer look at the other real key document, which is the OECD. So the OECD framework, that really sort of aims to promote a common understanding on due diligence for responsible business conduct, and is the key framework to support the implementation of due diligence. And it doesn't just cover, as I said, human rights. It also covers other topics like environment, health and safety, anti-bribery and corruption, etc. And it's a really key framework. So you've got the multinational, the guidelines for multinational enterprises, and you've also got another key document, which is the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business practice. And that sets out really 6 key steps, all of which are really included in these legal requirements. So it's about embedding the commitments from your human rights policy, as mentioned through the United Nations Guiding Principles, to identify and assess where your risks could be, and to seize, prevent and mitigate those risks, as well as tracking and communicating those, as well as that all-important remediation. So it's really important. So not only are these within all the legislation that's been talked of previously, but also in sort of growing regulations. So, for example, the EU taxonomy regulations, in order to be compliant, under 2 key topics, which one is the minimum safeguards and one is do no significant harm. You have to prove that you're aligned with the UNGPs and the OECD. So this sort of renders the implementation of the UN GPs and the OECD central to the attainment of environmental goals aligned to sustainable investment as well. So the key message is, what we tend to do as a business, or we try to do, is align our approach to respect human rights, taking into account these key frameworks, the UNGPs and the OECD, so that we can meet the demands of mandatory measures geared at promoting respect for human rights and other ESG objectives through reporting and due diligence, and therefore position ourselves to respond to this legislation, hopefully future legislation, ultimately with the aim of minimising any sort of potential future risk, but also, as Dave said, to make sure we respect human rights and really become a responsible business.
Well said, Catherine. I mean, as you said, it's daunting, but noble work, and something that has really brought us all together because we all value the human rights components and want to ensure our sector is solid and demonstrating all those right signals throughout the value chain. So let's move on to a different angle of the conversation. So when you focus on the obligations, what are the opportunities to enable other supply chain sustainability reporting expectations? And I know, Dave, you're going to lead that, but certainly Nadine or Catherine can chime in. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley, for that question. And before we go to the next slide, I want to further emphasize a point Catherine had made in her content, which is, one, if you find yourself in a jurisdiction where these higher bar compliance obligations are not yet on your doorstep, I really would recommend you reflect for a moment on what is the trend of where these laws are going, and think about, what does future proofing of your compliance posture look like? Another piece here too is also to keep in mind that we're all suppliers to each other. So as Catherine was talking about indirect effect of these compliance obligations, also position yourself to think about, how do I respond to my customer as they need to meet their compliance obligations? And to that end, if we now go to the next chart, we can continue to draw this string out a little bit further. On the left-hand side, you see that OECD due diligence model, if you will, that Catherine already walked us through, so I will not recap that. The takeaway here for us on the phone is, say you're not in a compliance role where you have to demonstrate these obligations to regulators, but you're in a corporate sustainability type role where you're creating your company's sustainability report, or you're responding to investor questions or investors' ratings methods for sustainability of your company. You're going to find these very same themes in supply chain sections of an ESG reporting framework like GRI or SASB. You'll also find it in the ratings methods investors use. In this case, I've pulled out the S&P Corporate Sustainability Assessment. And if you want to dig a little deeper into where exactly is this, within GRI, I highly recommend you take a look at Module 3, which is around materiality analysis. And that basically gets to step 2 in that OECD model is the first component of risk-based mapping. What are those relevant environmental and social concerns in your procurement categories and regions of the world in which you buy things from? The 308 and 414 are about supplier environmental assessment and social assessment. So it's building upon this risk-based mapping or materiality assessment for a supply chain to further understand how you are screening suppliers for environmental and social risks, looking at their maturity and management programs to address those risks, and driving corrective action to improve performance and, in essence, elevate all of our responsible business practices. And then clearly throughout the 400 series of GRI, you will often find a supply chain component in addition to the operational component of the topic being addressed, whether that's forced labor, child labor, other elements of human rights like workplace safety, freedom of association and bargaining, etc. And then lastly, in that S&P Corporate Sustainability Assessment, if you open up their methodology document and look at the supply chain section, pretty quickly the elements they're asking about are very much traceable to that OECD model on the left. You know, it starts with, do you have a supplier code of conduct and what's covered in there? Again, how are you doing the risk-based mapping, driving assessment, driving supplier performance over time? And that particular method there, the reason I like to pull it out is it's also asking for, where are your metrics that are the proof points for what it is that you are doing, not just saying that you're doing. So it's demonstrating your processes in action, if you will. And if you decide what are the key asked for across the compliance, the reporting works and the ratings methods, it's those bullets highlighted in the green bar below. Again, you really should open up these documents and give them a deep read to deeply understand. However, I tried to extract out the key pieces at the bottom of the slide, which I won't take time to read off today, but welcome further engagement with Workgroup 11 on these matters. And let's go to the next one, Ashley. Then I'd like to further extend this to is, we've been talking to you today around these compliance obligations in front of us, the connection to or the similarity to those ESG reporting and rating expectations. So how are we addressing this as the aerospace and defense industry within IAG? First off, again, on the left-hand side is that OECD due diligence model. And I've made the points to the right map back to it to help for clarity of connection of what is going on in our industry to be responsible supply chains. First off, International Forum on Business Ethical Conduct for the Aerospace and Defense Industry, otherwise known as IFBEC. It has a US equivalent called Defense Industries Initiative within the US, DII. But IFBEC has done a nice job of producing a model supplier of code of conduct that touches on multiple ESG elements and expectations that would connect back to these type of laws that we've been talking about today for supply chain duty of care. If you're looking for a place to begin to embed those responsible business conduct into your policies and your management systems, that provides a nice starting point for a model supplier code of conduct, but obviously you'd also want to be looking into adding clear human rights policies, responsible sourcing policies, and things of that sort. But within IAG Workgroup 11 specifically, one key piece that we are excited about is our takeoff initiative here, which really starts to get at other elements of the OECD model. First off, something we'll be talking about and ideating on within Workgroup 11 is, could we collaboratively address in an antitrust compliant manner this ESG risk mapping of where relevant environmental and social risk reside in procurement categories in global regions of the world. Another activity that we've already made substantive progress on is aligning on a reusable voluntary sustainability assessment for suppliers that will be powered by a third-party provider that allows us to efficiently move forward with this deeper due diligence or assessment of our suppliers through desktop audits of their not only broad sustainability performance, but also demonstrating that they have started to address these compliance obligations that are rippling through the supply chain. In steps 3 and 4, I think Workgroup 11 and the opportunity we have in front of us here is to think about where we work with a third-party provider to bring this assessment approach online, how it also provides the educational resources for suppliers to improve where the risk would suggest further maturation is needed, and tracking that over time within that third-party ecosystem of the progress being made. So we have this nice collection of further maturation plans, if you will, the educational resources to support it, and then the metrics, particularly at an industry level, to show how we are making a positive difference as the responsible and sustainable aerospace industry. And then in the 5th piece, something that we'll be ideating on and considering to do is, how do we start to tell an industry narrative, if we feel that's appropriate to do, about how we're driving responsible sourcing within our industry, and what does that look like? And then lastly, hopefully a piece that's of value to all of you on this call today is a space for us to come together and maintain situational awareness of what is changing in the supply chain duty of care compliance obligations, evolutions, as I noted earlier, in ESG reporting and ratings frameworks that will continue to tune the governance of how we keep this industry activity up and running and creating value for all, whether you're in a compliance role or a sustainability specific role that might get at customer facing and investor facing aspects. Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Dave. It's really great to see that takeoff logo out there where this audience is getting to see it first. It's definitely going to be kicked off in 2023. So look forward to everyone's reaction about being part of it going forward. Nadine, was there anything else that you wanted to foot stomp about Workgroup 11?
No, I think Dave summarized it well. I know some of this can seem very overwhelming, but I think we're starting to see the connections between the various standards, the various assessments, the compliance requirements. And I think the work that we're doing with Workgroup 11 is going to help bring that all together even further for us as an industry and enable us to be more effective and efficient in our compliance, as well as driving, more sustainable strategic decision making as well.
Thank you, Nadine. All right.
And actually, one other piece I want to add on to that before we move to the next one is also for those of you on the phone, if your company is not already a member of IAG, there's an opportunity to join the industry association, become part of Workgroup 11. And as noted a moment ago by Nadine, we're at the early stages of this. So you have an opportunity to influence and shape the voluntary standards that we come up with, and do this in a way that also protects us with those solid compliance guidelines that Jim mentioned in the beginning. So we do this the right way.
Thank you. Yeah, it's
Back
good
to you, Ashley.
Good to remember there's that shaping opportunity to come join us. You'll be joining a group of phenomenal individuals who come together that are really driven to make an impact and to help our supply chain. All right, so we've touched upon this. There's a lot of information. There's a lot to keep track of going forward because the trend is not slowing. So how can suppliers keep up with this evolving landscape of obligations? Dave, your thoughts?
Yeah, actually, I think my primary point is to emphasize what I mentioned a moment ago. Part of how we govern and sustain the Workgroup 11 activity over time is going to be driven by a portion of the governance approach, tracking the evolution of these laws, talking about what are the overlaps with things in ESG reportings and ratings frameworks. So we'll make that a part of our enduring way we run the work group, but then also start to make headway on what are informative, in a simple manner, infographics, if you will, that try to help bring down the complexity of what's in these things in a way that does not feel overwhelming, but are also actionable and informative. And that's a part of our Workgroup 11 journey to go, and I look forward to doing that. But I know IAG also has other things that it has been doing outside of the supply chain duty of care space for quite some time. And perhaps, Ashley, you want to highlight some of those for everybody's awareness for the value that's here today for them to harvest.
Absolutely. So we know we didn't touch upon more of the chemical regulations today. That was not within the focus, but that doesn't mean there's not resources out there today. And this really does showcase the 10 years that IAG has been in existence and working to tackle these emerging areas. There is a different work group 9, with the purpose there you see is committed to developing an approach to help the aerospace and defense industry evaluate those emerging global environmental and chemical regulations. So I want to highlight, because this is out there today and something Work Group 11 is looking as a best practice to emulate for the due diligence, duty of care obligations that we spoke about today. So right at your fingertips here on the IAG website, you can get those fact sheets, you can get alerts. This information is out there for you. And all part of this, we hope that you definitely check out these resources, but certainly along our journey, we're going to need your voice to help shape and understand. We know everyone is at a different point in the journey of where they are with their ESG maturity. And so just to take it back, I hope that you do check out those Work Group 9 resources. And that's just one example. Each of the work groups of IAG produce annually deliverables that are out there and available. And again, as Jim Wilson originally said, this is all voluntary and out there for you to determine if it fits. As far as our community, I mean, that's really what I think is coming and what is needed to help endure and bring the supply chain through all the information that's out there and keep the daunting away and make it digestible. We want to build this community. These webinars were a start. We appreciate that you've been here for this start of the first chapter. But we're certainly moving forward to building obligation awareness, because it's really important for you to understand what is driving us to act. And even our first webinar, it's really important for you to understand why ESG and why are you so critical to the formula of accelerating ESG for aerospace together. Take off. It's coming. We hope you join us in 2023 for what's ahead. And as I mentioned, all of this will need to be considered through your voice, through your perspective. And we know that. We certainly work individually through our companies with our suppliers and hear some struggles. And we want to try to bring forward information to help enable you to tackle those struggles. And so we look forward to bringing you much more in 2023. But with that said, another good resource is, like I said, IAG has expanded. We're growing. We're covering ESG now. We started this year with a member webinar that talked about ESG taking center stage, but it is available to you in a PDF to see what all the IAG member companies are saying, and the highlights from that event tell you a lot of the key messages that show you the leaders that are behind this and why they're behind this and how it really aligns and how we're in harmony as an industry. And so I would advocate for you to submit questions if you have them. I did see we had one question, two now. So let me just quickly offer to the panel, if you understand, we'll have to follow up if we can't answer it now. So I appreciate the difference between ILO and ISO pertaining to human rights obligations. Any initial thought on that? If not, we'll certainly circle back.
Do we still have Catherine on?
Let's see.
There
Does
she
not.
is.
Oh. Let's give her 1
Catherine is
second.
best suited to address this question if we get her back on.
Okay. While we're waiting for her to join us, the second question that we got was, how exactly can you apply for joining to be part of IAG? Dave, do you want to cover this one?
Yes. For individuals who are interested in joining IAG, we can connect you with our business director, Mr. Hellstrand, to do so, to have an initial conversation to understand what that process looks like. There is a form, an application form, if you will, on the IAG site as well, which I will go off and find and put into the chat while we're having the conversation here. I see Mark Walker added in. Thank you.
Yes, we're always welcoming new members.
Thank you, Mark, for doing it.
Thank you,
All right.
Mark. Thanks, Dave.
And Catherine, we had her and then she dropped out. Okay, I'll do my best to, oh, there she is.
I know, every time you mention her name, she comes back.
Am I on? Sorry, I'm having a bit of a nightmare with the technology.
And
Can you hear me
it.
okay? Yeah.
Yes.
So
yeah.
The ILO is the International Labour Organization, which mainly focuses on worker rights. I'm not sure of the ISO. Is that the International Standards Organization? I'm not sure, but ILO is definitely the International Labour Organization, which focuses on core rights and has workers' rights, and has a number of core conventions that form part of the UNGPs, the United Nations Guiding Principles. There are too many acronyms. I'm sorry, too many acronyms.
Hey, Catherine, if I added on to that, ISO, which I believe is what's being referred to here, is the International Standards Organization, produce standards, if you will, to get a certification against, or what I'll call guidance materials. ISO, for instance, has one. I forget the exact number on responsible sourcing, but it's more of guidance. It's not one you can get an ISO certificate against, like an environmental management system. So that to me is the difference here. I would tend to say that, as Catherine expressed earlier, following that string of the United Nations guiding principles to how they get further translated into soft law, if you will, with ILO, guidance and OECD guidance, and then eventually into the compliance obligations, is more the path to follow. If you see an ISO standard could help you demonstrate one of those compliance obligations, by all means, something worth exploring further. But the ISO standards do not define the compliance directly met. Would you think that's roughly on target, or?
Yeah, so just to add on to that, to be honest, there have been moves actually for an ISO standard on mandatory human rights due diligence. I think it's quite a long way off. There's already an ISO related to responsible business conduct, which is ISO 26000, but yeah, it's not a certificate. Whereas the proposed standard that I understand is being discussed at the moment on mandatory human rights due diligence would be a certificate. Yeah, so I think it's watch this space. I think, as you alluded to earlier, you know, this space is developing so quickly, and there are so many different things happening: legislation, regulation, guidelines, sanctions, and potentially now, ISO certification. Yeah.
The other piece, I'll put the final point on this one, is when you look in the ESG reporting and ratings methods, you'll notice they tend to cite UN guiding principles, OECD materials and whatnot. You don't very often see, if ever, citations of ISO standards as a way to address the tone or intent of the question in the methodology. Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Catherine, Nadine, and Dave for taking their time today to share with you this information.
Hey, Ashley.
Go ahead.
Sorry to slide in here at the last minute, but I did see one other question came through around Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and how to do that through the supply chain. And the piece, we're obviously don't have time to talk about that here today in detail, but I highly recommend people go out to the IAG website and look at the work products Working Group 3 has created that's focused on greenhouse gas emissions. One of their early deliverables was a methodology to estimate supply chain emissions, particularly, I want to say, tied to category 1, purchased goods and services, and category 2 of scope 3, which are your capital goods. That's a great starting place for you. And again, another reason to come in and join the IAG space and have further, deeper conversation.
Many reasons we've given you today.
With that, Ashley, I probably got us pretty close to the end here. Sorry about that.
No worries. I'm glad you caught that one, Dave. So I think we've given you many reasons to check out IAG and also be on the watch for what is coming next year, because Work Group 11 is only getting started, but we're building off of 10 years of excellent work done focused on the environment through the other work groups. So plenty to check out. Follow us on LinkedIn so that you're always getting the latest invites to upcoming webinars or resources that we promote. These charts in this recording will be made available. We hope you go back and check out the first one if you missed it. And again, thank you, audience, for taking the time today to join us and be part of this growing community. Wishing you the well through the end of the year, and we look forward to having you back here with us next year. Signing off.